Today we are skipping off for another tangent, and this one's going to be a little bit tricky, I think, because I've spoken to a lot of people whilst doing this and chatting about what I'm doing and what their views are and that sort of thing. It's really interesting. And there's a lot of people, I think, who don't go to church and certainly don't consider themselves Christians, but would be interested to some extent in finding out, there's something in the back of their mind that tells them that the view of the world doesn't quite stack up. The Big Bang, once there was nothing and then it exploded. It's like, what? But they're held back for various reasons. Some of it is as simple as it's just not on their agenda particularly, which was the case for me for 30 years or something like that. But one that keeps coming up that surprised me, is that there's a lot of people who don't want to go to church because they don't really like the look of church, but they also don't want to identify as a Christian or risk being identified as a Christian because they don't like Christians. I think important thing to note here is this is some Christians, spoiling it for everybody, but from the outside, obviously the whole Christian thing looks pretty weird, understandably, as it inevitably would. But it does seem most people can identify with some Christian they know who behaves in a certain way that they don't like, and in their head, that's what being a Christian is. So the big question today is, are Christians the biggest problem with Christianity? Tied up in this as well is that you sometimes hear people talk about Christianity as just a cult or something. So I think those two are very much related. So we're going to have a good old crack at that one as well. It's worth briefly noting that the reason I'm not a Christian is not because I don't like Christians. There are plenty of Christians I don't like, obviously. But I think that makes perfect sense, the whole idea that churches are not museums that display perfect people. They're hospitals where people who know they're not perfect go to try and improve, that sort of thing. So it makes perfect sense that you would see a lot of Christians who aren't perfect. But that's not really the point. I think the trouble is, as a sort of a marketing department issue for the church, it does seem to be causing a little bit of problem with some of their members. One of the most interesting aspects of this for me is that if you are truly a Christian, you see the world through a Christian lens, the world should look extraordinarily different than looking through a secular one. This in turn, approaching it with these two different lenses, should mean that your outcomes are very, very different depending on stuff. And I would consider myself to generally be a reasonably decent person. I think that's probably fairish to say. And I guess my core values you might list as something like responsibility, security, growth, wisdom, integrity, balance, kindness, relationships. And for me, those are all almost sort of ends in themselves because they give me a sense of sort of peace, security and meaning. I have to note here that I appreciate that there's an interesting question as to why that makes me feel any sense of meaning. But that's not sort of really necessary for this thought experiment. I have tussled with that though. I did that for years, and that's partly what led me to pick up the Bible in the first place. But if you have a look at this, we have in the middle here the sort of things I come up with, I've just said, being my sort of grounding values, as it were. And I think these could broadly fit into either a secular or a Christian model. But those middle values, how they're applied, could be very different if treated as principles leading to a Christian approach, sort of to the right there, or a secular approach to the left there. But even in my case, just in acknowledging that Christianity may be true, I think I've shifted meaningfully, if undramatically, towards the right. In addition to that, I at least acknowledge that I should be aiming to move further to the right, even if just in case. That's obviously massively oversimplified, but I think it does provide a sort of reasonable framework for sort of assessing, what direction are you pointing in life and where are your values aiming, that sort of thing. And I guess that's the same on the idea that sin, we've worked out from the Old Testament, isn't particularly naughty deeds. It seems to be more misplaced aim in life. So the lens you're looking through is going to make a huge difference to how you're aiming, even in very secular events, sort of thing. If we take my dad as an example, he was at least trying as hard as he could, actively and every day, to aim for the right there. So we're still looking at a terrible human being, insofar as we all are. But that would at least make him a better ambassador than average, I suppose, in that respect. And there's definitely a problem in the sense that people perceive people aren't doing that. They are trying or not trying to do better. And I have to say that's in spite of the fact that my dad was somewhat instinctively afflicted by a feeling that most people were basically morons. Unfortunately, something I'm similarly afflicted with. But he was trying to rise above that, and he was a great example of what it takes to try and do that. I also know a vicar now who is he's brilliant. You can see he's got some real bite to him, and not terrible or Bonville or anything like that. But you can actually watch him keeping himself in check, and it's a great reminder, which perhaps I have an advantage on. So I grew up with a vicar, so I know that my dad he would swear, and he thought rude folk songs were really funny, that sort of thing. Normal guy, just doing extraordinary things. And it's the same with this vicar chap as well. He's miles from the stereotypical old Church of England vicar type model. He's, a normal bloke trying to do extraordinary things and having to deal with himself along the way. But, a great example to Christians and to the rest of us to some extent. Perhaps that's a good summing up, actually, of what it should look like to be a Christian. Is at the very least someone who is trying to do better than they are. Something like that. I think no exploration of this would be complete without looking at judgmentalism, because I think that's a word that does tend to come up. And I think most people have had a run-in with a Christian who looks at them and just sort of frowns in disapproval. And I'm going to sort of shamelessly use an extreme example here, but if you take Jesus, had he met Hitler, would he have sneered and turned his nose up and just gone, "Oh, I disapprove of you," and off I'm going? Or would he have had him over for dinner and given him a chance at redemption? I don't know, maybe it is the former, and he would have just said, you brood of vipers and you're going to hell. But I don't think so. And it does seem that that is extreme, obviously, but if Christians could approach with that sort of mindset, these are valuable people created by God who need a shot at redemption, not necessarily your place to help them, but at least to interact well with them, to represent the church nicely, or rather to represent God nicely, then you'd think the word judgmental would be very unlikely to come up when people were asked what do they think of Christians. For the record, I'm not saying I can do it either. It is hard. That's not an easy thing. But I do think it's reasonable to expect grown-ups to be able to do hard things. And just because it's difficult doesn't mean to say that's an excuse not to do it, or to try, at the very least. But certainly the perception from the outside seems to be that doesn't seem to be happening quite as much as it should be. As a sort of a practical example, and a softer one, less extreme, so a more day-to-day, imagine a hypothetical instance which didn't actually happen at all, even slightly, if I had a disagreement with my employer because they went back on something that was agreed. The Christian lens teaches that you turn the other cheek, and if someone sues you for your shirt, you give them the cloak as well, give them your cloak as well. And that's, it's polar opposite, isn't it, to the secular one, which would say, well, that's wrong, so are you going to go and take legal action, or are you going to take your little business and you're going to go off and set up by yourself? And I think a lot of people would look at that and go, yeah, that's quite reasonable. For what they did, you should have done that. So you literally get opposite results in a normal sort of fairly mundane-ish day-to-day situation, depending on how you approach it. And hypothetically, if I had been in that situation, then I might have found doing all this reading and research and all the rest of it for the last 3 years might have shifted me from the left to the right, or the right to the left, whichever way around it was, towards the more Christian response, I'd like to think, maybe. But that discord between identifying as a Christian and then behaving in a way that doesn't look very Christian, you can see how that would be reasonable grounds for some people to look at, see a Christian doing what they're doing, and just think, I don't really want any of that. That's trying to be all self-righteous and all the rest of it, and then going and behaving no better than anybody else. Albeit, I suppose you have to acknowledge in that presumably we're not all created equal in our ability to self-improve. I suppose you could at least say that as a basic thing, you should be able to tell someone is kind if they're a Christian, even if you knew nothing else about them. I think that's fair. And I guess you can put into the mix that you get people who are a little bit sort of insecure or socially uncomfortable by themselves, and it can be difficult to be kind, I suppose, when you're feeling a little bit sort of don't come near me sort of thing. But by and large, I guess that's quite a low bar still. There's a lot of behaviour above that point where we should be seeing stuff done a bit better. Finally, on that point, I think one of the things for me that sort of slightly grates is the question of certainty, which I've talked about before. But if you talk to a Christian and they're gushing with enthusiasm for God did this and God does that and Jesus loves you and you pray and it's all going to be good, it comes off as very certain, which on the basis that you instinctively know you can't be certain, therefore the person looks a bit crazy. And I do think it would help people outside Christianity immensely to know and have it acknowledged that people don't know for sure. We talked before about the idea that there's tons of evidence, so don't get me wrong, it's not like it's a finger in the air and just speculation. There's plenty of evidence, so you can get pretty solid foundation, but that little bit on top to actually accept it, I suppose, has got to be some sort of faith bit, which by definition must be lacking in certainty. I mean, obviously the vicar can't go up to the front of the church on the Sunday and start saying things. I'm not sure if any of this is true, but this is basically my understanding. The sort of hedgy language that I use, which I realise is extraordinarily annoying for people. So I don't quite know how you would do this practically, but for some element worked in there that there was an acknowledgement that, yeah, we're not 100% sure. I mean, my dad acknowledged that, as I've talked about before. He still believed he was right, but he acknowledged, you can't be 100% on basically anything, I suppose. Is that fair to say? But some sort of acknowledgement would perhaps remove some of that barrier, which I think to some extent alienates people outside looking in and seeing someone with faith. Another and perhaps lesser part of the problem, I suppose, is that people don't want to go to church. And I've started going for the last couple of years now, on and off, and little bits here and there, just sort of dabbling. As I've said before, I think it's wonderful, partly I think it's deeply uncomfortable and a bit weird. It's kind of a difficult one, but I've had a very sort of positive upbringing in the church, which helps, I suppose. But in doing this whole YouTube exercise, I've discovered there is so much evidence for this stuff. And yet there's so much misinformation that goes out generally, and people are pottering along doing their daily thing, and generally I think believe that there is no evidence for Christianity at all, which is very much not the case. And it does seem that most Christians, on average, are not well enough equipped to deal with that and how to evangelise and spread the gospel, that sort of thing, which I believe they are supposed to do. I haven't read that bit yet, but I'm pretty sure it's in there somewhere that you're supposed to do that. But how you do it really matters, because I think if you do it wrong, you can actually push people further away. And it's not entirely clear that there's a route into the church for everybody, which we'll come back to in a minute. But an example of something I've encountered recently, and this is not a criticism of the person in question, but it was suggested to me that I should pray before I read the Bible, before I do my video for each one, and basically pray for understanding, that sort of thing. Okay, great. The trouble is, the response for me is a difficult one of standing there looking at this person going, okay, well, the whole point is I don't believe in God. So praying would be a little bit weird, wouldn't it? As a suggestion, it's not the most helpful thing. Don't get me wrong, I would at least try and claim I'm more open-minded than average. So I get there can be some sort of mindfulness ritual in it, or, fake it until you make it sort of thing. And potentially there could be some value in that. But generally speaking, I don't think that's particularly helpful. Not to the extent that it's going to derail me because I'm neck deep in this and loving it. But the average person in your life who comes along and says, I'm sort of interested in this whole God and Jesus stuff, and how do I go and find out what to do next? And if the answer is sit in the dark and have a little prayer and trust in Jesus and all that sort of thing, I'm sure there are some people for whom that would be the perfect route, but I suspect they're in the minority. And it seems in there's an interesting gap in the market, as it were. So you've got church caters for the people who like going to church, which is great, but that, as I understand it, is less than 20% of the Christian population of the country, as in less than 20% of people who self-identify as Christians actually go to church. So the church, absolutely has to cater for those people. And the church I go to, there's 200 people there every Sunday. So, it's doing a great job, and that is really working for those 200 people. So they're taken care of, as it were. But of everybody else, church would be suitable, I think. And the one I go to is so warm and welcoming. It's wonderful. So if you were feeling you needed to ask some questions or just want to come and dip a toe and have a look, you could absolutely just walk in the middle of a service, sit at the back quietly. Someone would come and say hello to you. Someone nice would come and say hello to you. Whether you want that or not is another matter entirely. And you could just dip your toe. And some people, I think, just sort of expose themselves to that, feeling the comfort of that. Because I think there is... Well, C.S. Lewis said there is unspeakable comfort in Christianity. For some people, that might be enough, and that would get them in, and fully accept that. At the other extreme, there's someone like me, and I guess this YouTube project probably singles me out as being not entirely normal. And basically what I did, I sort of barreled in there, went straight to the clergy and said, I want to do crazy things. I want to go and do a live event where we talk about really difficult stuff about the Old Testament. We get yelled at. And then I want to go and kidnap a professor from the local theological college in London and then get him to come and do us a tour of Old Testament artefacts in the British Museum, which hopefully is actually happening in November, December. So if you want to come, you're very welcome. But I do think that I'm likely to be unusual in that. I accept that. And the person who just wants to sneak in at the back and just have a little quiet join in, or not even join in, just watch and observe and absorb in gently, that's probably not many people. So in the middle, presumably, is a lot of people with vague, interesting questions, but there seems to be no sort of format for them to come and engage with it. I should say I fully accept that probably the majority of people, no matter what you did, they're not going to come anyway because they're just bustling around doing their thing, say, as I was doing for 30 years. And it won't even particularly have occurred to them to come and do something. But certainly people I've spoken to would be vaguely interested and might even come with me, except that the format and stuff is not particularly to their liking. I do wonder in that, therefore, if there might be a place for some sort of format where you don't come along and sing and chant and all the rest of it that can look very, very weird from the outside, even for someone who grew up in the church, and something that's more teaching based or wrestling with difficult questions. And I mean, I think it's fun anyway. And I acknowledge that obviously I'm at that weird end of things and I love that sort of thing. But that doesn't mean everybody would. So, but yeah, either way, it just seems that there is a massive group of people being missed. And it does beg the question, is there a format for something that could suit them? The cult thing, I think actually, you can really go down the rabbit hole with this because there's definitions of what a cult is and all the rest of it, but I don't think those answers are very satisfying. But the perception that Christianity looks a bit like a cult does seem to be part of the problem. And to some point, I think this is sort of unfair, because if you live in a very secular world where you just deal with what's in front of you and you suddenly look at a Christian thing, no matter what they're doing, it's going to look weird because it's just completely alien to the whole idea of a secular world. But I stumbled across this thing the other day in some of my dad's stuff. And this is the Walk of 1,000 Men, which was a sort of an evangelical outreach thing back in the 90s. And my dad did a few years of it. You can get a very frumpy jumper with it as well, which I think my daughter's nicked. And, it was a noble thing. It was basically a bunch of blokes going off to go and walk the Pennines, I think was the last one that my dad did. And then where you encounter people, you share the word and help people and that sort of stuff. So it was really nice. But if you were being really unkind in cherry picking some of the rules on that sheet, you'd find things like keep mind and senses clear and sober. Look daily for natural opportunities to share Christ. Place Christ above all others and all else. Be willing to suffer for Christ. I don't think it would take a marketing genius to paint that as a bit weird and sounding a little bit culty. But for all the noise around this, my feeling is you can boil it down to two questions. The first one being, if Christianity were true, could it still look a bit like a cult from the outside? And the answer to that would be an obvious and very easy yes, of course it would, because it could be true and that's what it looks like. So yeah, fine. And then the second question, does Christianity potentially looking a bit like a cult from the outside disprove it? Which has the answer of an obvious no. So I think it's one of those things that looks a little bit like it makes sense. So like the Ricky Gervais thing of I only believe in one less God than you do, which sounds really reasonable and intellectual, but actually if you, as I said before, if you sit in the dark and think about it for 10 minutes, you realise it makes no sense at all. And the cult thing's a bit like that. But that being said, it still can make people feel a bit squirmy, so it's still a hurdle to deal with. And admittedly, I don't know what the answer is in terms of how you would deal with that. But it is certainly something that the church could do with overcoming to some extent, somehow. So, with the question, are Christians the problem with Christianity? I think the answer has to be, in part at least, yes. I think that would have to be conceded. But I do think largely that results from a misperception from people on the outside of what Christians should be, and like the idea that a Christian should be this perfect person like Jesus. And it's like, well, no, that's obviously not going to be the case. Or it's logically not going to be the case, perhaps not obvious. So I do think that is, to some extent, a misperception, but it's not all misperception. You know, some people do actually see people who are saying they're Christians doing terrible things. I've seen some of this at work, people who identify as Christians rolling in money and doing all sorts of things that you just like, that doesn't seem very Christian to me. And they are not doing favours. I do wonder that perhaps are they cultural Christians rather than actual Christians. I guess that can be a problem. But I guess I'm sort of lucky in that. Having said I grew up in the church, so I met loads of Christians and I lived with a vicar. So, you know, mostly I knew and still know a bunch of wonderful people. And to be fair, even the iffy ones, you could see they were at least trying to do better. And I will give a lot of credit to someone who's at least trying, even if they are still a bit of a punk in the process. I would have to say, on the basis that my feeling is that the world would be a better place with more proper Christians in it, not people who say they're Christians and just do other stuff, proper actual Christians living as Jesus intended with, you know, love your neighbour as yourself sort of thing. So I do think it's sad that the perception from the outside is that people are put off because of people not behaving the way that people want to see, that sort of thing. But to some extent, people outside the church do also need to acknowledge that just because you become a Christian, it doesn't automatically just get rid of all your demons. Metaphorical demons there, obviously. But for Christians, you have to say, I mean, it's in the first chapter of Genesis, literally at the start of the Bible, that God creates humans in his image. And it seems reasonable that that means that what you're supposed to be doing is the idea of reflecting God's character in the world. And a lot of people aren't doing that. So in the same way as if I go to an employer event and behave like a moron, I'm not representing my employer very well. The same is true of Christians. It's a difficult one because there's no 9 to 5 on that, is it? It's all the time. But yeah, I mean, that's obviously a big responsibility and a really difficult one at the same time. But you'd have to say that some Christians, at least, need to do a better job of working out how they're supposed to behave, working out how to do a better job of representing God on earth, particularly to those who are outside the Christian sphere, as it were, and just trying harder not to be a twat.